more for the cameraman that he puts me to the right light. So he's doing a great job. Now, I appreciate that you're here. I know it's been a long conference, and as joyful it is to have a keynote on the very first day, which I hadn't, but as kind of, how can I say, a pity it is if you have to have the last presentation because you feel like you're cleaning up, which is not, in fact, what I'm supposed to do here. This presentation, nevertheless, is less technical, so I will not drill down into deep in any kind of code lines, just talk a bit about JavaServer Faces, talk about the way that, though this platform is very good to use for today's web application, to point out what are the areas that you can improve the code in there, and second, what we did in our upcoming ADF Faces Rich Client technology to already improve some of the missing components as we see it. Some of the subjects I'm talking about are there already in some kind of open source project or planned for later release of JavaServer Faces, but we have it right now. So what I want to talk about is quickly do a crash course just for those of you who never had worked with JavaServer Faces. By the way, anyone here who never worked with JavaServer Faces? Just to get a feeling if it makes sense? Okay, it makes sense. And then we will talk about perfecting the image, so we have a very good impression. I tell you, after I let you through JavaServer Faces, you will have a good impression, and then we will see how to perfect the image. Sometimes I learned it is good to build up a castle to say and showcase how great something is, just to tear it down. And then by rebuilding it, showing how it could be much better. So, the crash course. So, first of all, it's supposed to simplify web development. Of course, it's not simple for those people who are brand new, who start with no background knowledge. They always will find some kind of learning curve that they consider too steep. But from a web developer perspective, who worked with servlets, who worked with JavaServer Pages, or someone who is used to work with 4GL tools, JavaServer Faces is just a step into the right direction. Because you're developing on a component-based set, you're not working markup-driven, which means changes in a component are much easier because you can just swap out the component. There's a library of component out there, something that you can't find with markup. There are many markup libraries, but if you code in JSP or if you code a structured application, your application basically contains everything in it. So it's part of the page, it's not a component. It also supports other clients other than browsers, though in fact, yes, you can say that 99.9% of all devices that we run on our applications today are browsers, but in the future that might change, and we will see maybe that there's an uptake for iPhones or for other mobile devices that want to run an application. Now, instead of you developing your application again, you might look for a solution that allows you to keep on going with the application you have and just run it on a different device, and then have the device, or actually the application, detecting the device, responding to that, just having the renderer interface adapted to the device, instead of you writing the application again. Now, in the past, I can remember there were a great deal on the technology to code for mobile devices, but in the end, if you had one application that needed to run on a mobile device and on a browser, you would have to code it twice. And one of the main arguments to use it, of course, it's part of the standard, so that will have maturity, so that will have a long lifetime, so we're not expecting that to go away overnight, something that nobody would guarantee you on a smaller project. So this is why, for instance, Oracle internally decided to use JavaServer Faces as a foundation for what we build in Oracle applications and for our main strategy. Though we do support JavaServer Pages development and HTML development and JavaScript development, if you like, for our internal development, we decided a strategy that is based on JavaServer Faces. Now, there's some key terminology to know when you talk about JavaServer Faces. First of all, there's a UI component. The UI component is a component that either shows a specific widget on the client or that ensures that the widget can be laid out. So either it's a container or a component that has a UI. What they don't know is how they look, but actually they know everything about themselves. They know how to behave, they know what happens if someone types in data, if someone hits submit, they know to pass it on, so you don't have, unlike in the struts case, make sure that all the parameters are read and passed when you have a request. It's all handled for you. And then there is a managed bean facility. Now, a managed bean is a POJO. It comes with a no argument constructor, and that is fully maintained by the JavaServer Faces framework. You don't care for, as a developer, when it's initiated, because it's just there when you start using it. And one of the examples for a managed bean is where if a user types in data into a text field and he submits the data, you want to respond to if the data he types in, if this data is a valid data. So actually you want to pre-check before the data gets stored and maybe raise an exception if you put a wrong data in. Then you have expression language. Expression language is a scripting notation that you use to bind the UI, the text field in this case, or an action event like a button or a command button, to bind this to the underlying model. The underlying model can expose an execute query that you want to access from a button, or it could also have attributes that belong to a table exposed on the Java object, and you use expression language. The benefit of using expression language is you don't code it. So it's mostly a line of script, whereas if you would code that with all getting the dependencies, would be many more lines of code. Navigation cases, as in struts, where you navigate from one struts action to another, JavaServer Faces is similar. It navigates from one page to the other. It's not quite as flexible as struts, because especially if you want to do some kind of pre-processing, so if you want to, before someone goes on a page, you want to check if he's authenticated. That's easier to do in struts than it's in JavaServer Faces, sorry. But you can do the same in JavaServer Faces. There is a way to listen to specific events in a face event, for instance, and then response to that. But the basic idea is that the navigation case just is a metadata-driven way to navigate from one page to the other. So navigation is not hard-coded in the application. Navigation is in a metadata file, and it's declarative, fully declarative. And the last thing is lifecycle. Now, the lifecycle of a JavaServer page application is quickly told. Request, response. That's it. So there's no interaction. Now, in a JavaServer face case, you have 6 steps within that. So one is apply request values. So the request comes in, the view, if it's not new, gets restored, and then the request gets applied. Then you have the event validation, so where you validate everything that got applied to the request. Then you update the model, then you invoke the application, in which case the application really refreshes itself, so it just prepares for itself, and that is also the time when a specific action, like a navigation to the next page, is executed. That's called invoke application. And the last thing is render response. This is now when your application goes back. You see all the intermediate steps I mentioned, and on each of these steps you can listen to and you can respond to. So it's not that a request sails in, and while it sails in, you're helplessly, you can't control it anymore. So that's one of the benefits in JavaServer Faces. The managed bean, it has a scope. And the reason why it has a scope is that you can use it as a model. So if somehow you need to hook up to Enterprise Java Beans or Session Facade, or hook up to a JVC call, maybe, just to get data into a table. Now, the connection link here could be a managed bean. Now, in this case, you want to have the managed bean maybe in session scope to avoid that the data is fetched all over again. So you have several scopes, application, which means that one managed bean is shared by all instances of an application. It's kind of a singleton approach if you want to. Then you have session, which is the bean gets instantiated the first time it is called, and then it lives within the session up to the point where you close your application. Request, well, that's the most obvious one. Between 2 requests, you have a scope, the way you can store temporary data, just data that you want to pass from one page to the other. And none is if the managed bean just provides static information or static response, if it doesn't have to hook into the life cycle, so that you have a method that returns a handle to another resource. Now that doesn't need half a scope. So one example of a JSF page is, as you see here, so it in fact starts with markup, though it's not markup, but it needs to have a markup page to live in there. And then it builds up a component tree on the server side, so it's an object tree. Every UI component is represented by an object. If you look, for instance, into ADF Faces, which is a component set based on the reference implementation, then the table actually has an object called core table. And the JSP tag that you use instantiates the core table, and that is held within the memory for the time that you work on the page. And that's all handled by JSF, so you don't have to take care of that, so no risk that you forget about an object, and that will then end up as a memory leak. The UI component is referenced by the JSP tag. In this case, it's the reference implementation, referencing an input text value, expression language. As you can see here, there's a route in front, then there's an emp.name, which means that there is a bean, a managed bean called emp, and there's an attribute on it, a getter and setter method pair called name. And when you type something into the field and you submit, then this managed bean will be called, and the value that you type in will be put down to the managed bean. And the managed bean then is free to decide when to update the persistence layer. If it's EGP or if it's a JDBC call, if it's a web service, whatever you want to call. Now, as said, JavaServer Faces is really great, and Oracle also contributed to this development. And originally we had a technology called UIX, which was similar, working like JavaServer Faces, was following along with these ideas. And we dumped that technology just in favor of JavaServer Faces, because JavaServer Faces really is something that allows us to do a lot of things on the web that we couldn't do within the markup world. But still, you know, it's always like, you know, if I look at my kids, I have a 4-year-old and I have a 9-month-old. If you give him something, there's always something better he likes, yeah. So it just keeps him happy for an hour maximum, and then he wants something better. Now it's the same with IT programmers. So we always find something that we think, yes, it could be improved. And so is what we did. So as mentioned, we use that internally, and internally we have a group of more than 7,000 developers working on Oracle applications, and they have a stack that they use to build. And now they come up with their requirements. And in some cases, we come to the conclusion, yes, we can do that, but this requires more coding. And then they would say, yes, nice to hear that we can do that, but more coding is not an option, because more coding means for me that I have to work longer on that. I have milestones to meet, so it's not productive. So make me productive. And this is where we came up for Release 11, which currently is in technology preview, and you can get from OTN, from the Oracle Technology Network, with some enhancements that are generic enough to not only work within the Oracle environment, but you should also be able to take some of what I will introduce here to use with Trinidad from Apache, Tomahawk, or other third-party libraries. So it's not dependent on the Oracle platform. The whole ADF Faces component just requires you to have JavaServer Faces 1.2. Basically, whenever you build something on the J2E 5 level, that will work for you then. So the good in JSF, it's part of the Enterprise Edition, as I said. Simplifies the stuff. On the controller front, it offers a simple way to define page flows, declarative. One of the advantages of a declarative page flow always is you can take your application to the end user, and you just create empty pages just to understand how his working habits are. You say, is this really how you work? And once he says, yes, this is how we work, you can go back and you have exactly his working habits just drawn on a diagram with no life and no flesh in it, and then you can start working, which is a nice approach to take. Most important, there are lots of tools available to work with JavaServer Faces. So unlike, for instance, a tool like Visual Basic or Oracle Forms, we just had one vendor offering you a tool to work with that. Now this technology is adopted by BA, IBM, CodeGear, MyClips. I'm not sure if IntelliJ is doing JSF right now. I would assume that, but they're more on the coding level, so I wouldn't expect them to provide something like that. But the others all have nice little integrated environments to build JavaServer Faces applications. Of course, most of it declarative, because this really makes us productive. Now, limitations you might be hitting. Templating. Now you know that from JSPs, you had JSP includes just to make sure you have a consistent look and feel. Components. The reference implementation that Sun provides is lacking the complex components. It's just providing you a base set of components that is not enough. So you need more complex components. You need more components that are desktop-like. And there are many libraries out there, and ADF Faces is one of them that provides you that. Ajax. The future definitely speaks interactive desktop-like application. So no longer the bored traditional applications. So you need to find a way into Ajax really without wasting your time on learning it, going into the fine-grained details of how to set up an Ajax application, how to build with that. So ideally, the component understands that. Component development, you want to simplify that. Now, one example is, well, in JSF, there is an API that you can use to build your own components, right? So they will explain to you, there are 3 files or so that you have to edit to create your own component. You write a renderer, write your own component stack, and the tag library for it, and then you can use it with any tool. But what if, for instance, your component that you need is just a composite of an existing component, of a text field and a button, and you always want to see the two as a pair? Now, how do you build that? You don't want to build that from ground up. So there needs to be a way to simplify component development if there's an existing component set. Scopes, I just mentioned the 4 scopes we have. There are some missing. In Ajax, you have in-page refresh. Now, which scope would cover that? Not the request scope, because the request scope would be on the parent page, right? So you need to have more scopes for that. JavaServer Faces config file. I just said that in struts, navigating from one action to the other action was more comfortable for those people who need to do pre- and post-processing. Now, there's something obviously missing in the navigation handling of JavaServer Faces, so we need to extend that. Bookmarking. Bookmarking, if you're working with JavaServer Faces, then the framework is doing most of the things, which means that in the URL you never see any status attributes, so any attributes that are just there to keep the state, as you would see in a normal GET request, for instance. Now, there need to be a way to provide you the ability to perform a bookmark, though you don't see the URL. And flows. Now, imagine you have a magazine subscription flow. So someone comes to a magazine page. Yes, I want to subscribe to this magazine. Now, do you have already an account with our company? If yes, just sign in. If you don't have an account, create it first. Now, you can use that flow on so many applications. So what you want to do is you want to reuse that and not with copy and paste. So there needs to be a way to get out the flow that you created with all its logic and just be able, within a jar file, to reuse that on other applications. And this is what it's all about. So let's first talk about templating. So there is no templating today in JavaServer Faces. There are some solutions available, which include Facelets, which is an open source project, very popular. But that has the kind of a disadvantage, I would say, that it's more like a wrapper around JavaServer Faces. It asks you to change the file extension. It asks you to adapt your application to it. Then you have JSF templating, which is an effort that Sun brought in, and there is a new templating mechanism in ADF Faces Rich Client. So while I show you how you build templates, I will also give you the story behind of what the benefit of this templating approach is. So to create a template, so here in my JDevelop environment, I do have 3 projects. So the View Controller project is what I configured to be my JavaServer Faces project. I create a new page by just say calling new, and then I have a section called JSF, which gives me access to all the functionality that JDevelop exposes for JSF developers. And one option is JSF Templates. So let's go to JSF Template. A JSF template that we built is a normal JSF page. It just comes with additional metadata. Now I give it a name, so let's call that my 3 splitter layout. It has a name, and this is the name actually where it shows later on when I create a JSF page, shows in the display. So for me to select, so I know that I have that. Templates can be within my project, but templates can also be exposed as a library. So I can create a jar file-like library that I then distribute among my developers, and they will reuse that and will see my templates by the name. I do have the ability to specify facet definitions. Now, a template typically is a piece of art, right? So you have graphic designers that have a very clear vision of how an application has to look. Now, what they want to have a very nice looking UI, and then they want to give the developer only specific areas within this nice looking UI to put their stuff in. So the rest of that should ideally be read-only. And that's exactly what we do. So you specify facets for that. I spare the description. This is where you would put in what the meaning of that facet is, so that someone who uses your template understands exactly what the facet is expected to carry on. So I have a top, let's have a bottom left, and let's have a bottom right. So my template will have 3 facets. So 3 areas where the developer later on will be able to drop his components. Then I have the ability to specify attributes. Now, because they are reusable components, I can't hardwire anything. I can't rely on the information being available that in the session there's a specific attribute. I can't rely on that as a reusable component. But what I can do is I can expose attributes. I can say, within my templates, I use 3 attributes. I use an attribute, say, first name, last name, and date. And then I compose that in my template to hello, first name, last name, date. Nice to have you here. Now, I rely only on my attribute. The user who uses my template will see the attributes and he can wire this up. He could, for instance, the first name, he can use expression language to wire that up to request scope, get username, or whatever. So he's responsible for squeezing that information in. Templates that have their own binding, their own functionality, like if you have a kind of a yellow page template that has a small section that queries the database for some users to get the mail address or the phone number, then this binding could be included to the template as well, and will be reused on the pages. Okay, so that's my empty template, so it's nothing on it yet. So what I first need to do is I need to create my look and feel. So let's create a simplistic layout in that I use a panel splitter. Okay, so I need, because I have a region that I call top, so I need to have this panel splitter in a vertical layout. I will have this completely enlarged. Okay. So now for the second one, I drop another one. So now you see I have my top, bottom left, bottom right. This is what I built. That's my basic layout. So I spare myself putting images in. Believe me, I'm the greatest artist on the world. I could do images in. In fact, I can't. But anyway, I'm not an artist, but I will find an artist and I will pay him for making me a beautiful web page, and then I have my template. So I have 3 areas. So I'm coming from a functional perspective. Then you have a tag called, as soon as I find it, I'll show it to you. Let's close that. Here it goes, facet ref. And this facet ref you use to define the areas where developers are allowed to put components in. So I have 3 of them, bottom left and bottom right. So this doesn't do it here, so let's do it here. Okay, saving my template. As said, I'm not doing any more graphics on it. And now I have my template. Now this template already I could take and could distribute among my developers. One of the benefits of the template is, and I told you I will tell you while I built that one, it is adapted at runtime, not compile time. So it's not added to your page. Now what does that mean? Now it means as long as you have templates that use the same facet references, so as long as you have a facet reference top, bottom left, bottom right, you could use expression language to swap out the template on the fly. If you have someone who likes to read from left to right, give him the default template. If someone needs to have it vertical, it also has a small device, switch it according to his preferences. So you can do that. So it's passed while we run the application. It's not injected to the page code. Which also makes it easy to enforce corporate standards. So if I have it in a jar file, and every developer will adapt to that, so he will use my jar files just to build his applications, use their templates in there. Now if I change my mind, if I got a better graphic artist and I have new templates, I just need to swap out the library. And at runtime, the application takes the new library, the new template. So that's pretty straightforward. More components. Well, as we had it in 10.3 already, we provide a lot of complex set of components, including layout components like panel accordions, that these are this kind of moving areas when you click on them. Then splitter, as you've seen it, we provide drag and drop. So we have components for all the gestures that you want, plus very, very a big number of components that actually provide more complex functionality, list of values, calendars, and so on. Plus, we have something that we call data visualization tools, DVT. And this is a set of graphic components that you can use to produce charts, dynamic charts, charts that you can choose how they should render. If you want to have a chart rendering as an image because of the bandwidth that you have available, then do that. It's a property to set. You can change it up to the point where you say, I want to have a specific graph being rendered as a Flash component. So automatically, it's the same coding. It's just rendered differently. And then you have the ability, if the component supports it, for instance, to zoom in, which is something that you want to do with timescales or timelines. So that's all part of the component set. As said, it's not only Oracle working on additional components, it's just that everybody can work on additional components, and they would be interchangeable, so they're not really dependent on a specific platform. Here you see some examples coming from Trinidad, which is an open source project, Backbase, IceFaces, Rich Faces, which is JBoss. They all provide their component set. And if you go to the internet, it's I looked it up, it's www.jsfmatrix.net. On my first presentation, I said the wrong URL, but this is www.jsfmatrix.net. And there's a table of all components that you can get in different libraries and what they can do. So you can just say, okay, I need to have this component, and then you look it up in the matrix and you use it. Now, looking beyond components, what else do we provide? Now, I said that we also provide additional Ajax functionality because that is actually where the industry is going to. So we provide drag and drop functionality. We provide a dialog on pop-up frameworks. So you don't have to code with the DHTML to get a light-white component or a light-white window popping up. So we have that as a component. We provide partial page rendering, which is that you specify with a property which area on a page should refresh in a response to an activity on another component. The easiest one would be a button is pressed, you want to refresh the table. But another one could be you have a table, you change the row, but you want to have the form refreshed. That is what we call partial page refresh. There are different names for the same thing. In fact, what we do is we issue an Ajax request to the server, but you don't see the Ajax request. You're not dealing with that. You're just dealing with JavaServer Faces. And not to disappoint those who like to use JavaScript, we provide a complete JavaScript API. And this JavaScript API allows you to access components from the browser page. Because there are use cases that you cannot ignore that would require actually the integration to happen on the client side. So I'm not a fan of client-side integration, because I think integration should be on the middle tier, but there are some use cases where you want to have that. Be it that you get some information from some kind of flying service, yeah, so it's something that comes in, sails in on the browser, information you get from the browser, a cookie that you want to pass on to the application, something that really makes sense in the context of the application, then you can use the client-side JavaScript framework. Now, a wish list is, of course, that we all unite, so that everybody working on a component set would sit together, come up with a standard for Ajax and JSF. There's a group called Open Ajax Alliance that is looking for standardizing the way that Ajax works. Now, we need something similar for JavaServer Faces, because if you work with Ajax, you perform DOM manipulations. Now, if the one component performs a DOM manipulation that breaks the other, then that was it with interoperability. Now, in web services, in their origins, when they started with web services, they didn't have interoperability. Actually, they didn't have interoperability certifications. Now, everybody could do what he wanted. Now, they got it. And now, based on that, they can work together. So services are supposed to work together. Now, the same is needed for JavaServer Faces. It's currently not a project at any kind of standardization gremium, but that would be needed. That would be nice, because that would give you, as a developer, a huge plethora of components by hand, where you don't have to think about, does this component work with that together? Because if they are certified, then that would be it. So let me show you quickly an Ajax-enabled component. So I go back, building my page now. So now I say, create a new Java server page. So that should be my browse page. Use a template. Here's my 3-splitter layout. And just create my page based on that. So you see I have 3 areas where I can work with: top, bottom left, bottom right. I could now drag and drop components from here. What I want to do instead, I want to use the table as an example for an Ajax component. So let's drop it as a table. I want want to have row selection, filtering, sorting. And also what I want to do is, I want to have the ability, because, well, if it's the only component in the page, then of course it will take the full page. But once I start adding more components, then the area in which I show my table might be just too small, which means I would have to scroll horizontal or vertically. Now that's fair enough to do, but what if you need to edit the table? And there is a functionality I want, which is I press a button and the whole table jumps out of its bed, taking the full page. And there is a component that does that for me. So I just go to my table. Now I say, surround this table with what we call a panel collection. And this panel collection comes with additional functionality. One is what I described. Other functionalities is to show, hide specific functionality, plus it allows you to add additional menu functionality. So let's run that. So while this has a complete Ajax behavior now, including that I could respond to row selection or row changes, yeah, it's nothing that I have to code for. I just found my library. My library is written by some smart developers, which I hope. I don't have to deal with browser incompatibility, because the library is supposed to tell me against which browser it is certified and which one it is and is not certified. So I'm not dealing with that. As a business developer, and I think we need to really separate the types of developers. So we have business developers. Those understand business. They know how a bank is working. They know how an insurance is working. They know how ships are sold. And that's all business developers. And then we have Java developers, geeks, people that know about the ingredients, people that you tell, code me a mailing service, and they code your mailing service because they understand technology, right? So the business developer typically is asked to be productive, very quick, while the other one is given time to work on an architecture for an application, suggest an architecture, study different APIs, components. This guy will take his time, but the other guy is supposed to be very productive and should build applications as soon as possible. The same for the requirement to maintain these applications later on. So now it's starting up. So it's starting up the embedded server that we have within JDeveloper. So it's not really deploying to an external server first. So now it's coming up. It will have a nice little splash screen up front, which is what I call end-user entertainment, so that he knows something is happening. In fact, we just shuffle the resources onto the client. Everything could be customized, so all the components have a style sheet selector that you can configure in a file on the server side. We call that skinning, so that instead of just going with the look and feel that you see here, you can build up your own look and feel. So you see it's almost taking all the space already because there's no other components, in which case, because I didn't set the splitter to be a fixed size, the table will take all the sizes. So you see I can scroll. I can try and click on the detached button, and then you see that it comes in a window that I can move around. Now that would be if I'm lacking more space, where this window will just jump out of the area where maybe my table is that small and allows me to do comfortable editing. I also have the ability to shuffle around columns. Now that's all part of the component, and that's the whole deal about JavaServer Faces, to abstract from the developer to save him from developing it. So we will develop more. So simpler component development. I mentioned the example where I said that, well, if you build a declarative component, or if you want to have a component that is a composite of two other existing components of a library, you don't want to build it from scratch. You don't want to start building the renderer. You just want to reuse what exists. And you want to have it in a way that you can share with your developers. It should not only work within your project. It should work as a library, as a JSP tech library that you build declaratively. And this is currently missing in JavaServer Faces. And that is an approach that actually we needed for our in-house developers to be more productive, because they have the requirement to build sophisticated pieces of a page, either as a layout or just as a functionality. So this is what declarative components are doing. Now, declarative components are often confused with templates, which in fact they're not. A template always is the layout, the design for a page. A declarative component is just a little bit of a page. It could be an area of a page, a container, or a bit of visual UI. It's never the full page. So I have a project to create a declarative component, so say new, JSF, and then I have an entry for JSF declarative component. So it asks me what to do, so let's call it user info. It writes into a normal JSF file. Let's call it user info.sample. I need to create a tag library, but in fact for me it's just like giving it a name. Let's stick with user info. User info, because I wrote it, so my name is Frank Nimphius, so let's have a prefix of fn, just to make sure the namespace is set. Again, like within templates, I can specify attributes, method definition, and facet definitions. The facet definition is if you want the developer to put additional components into your declarative component. So if your declarative component is a piece of layout, like a grid that you build out of other components, and you want the developer to put his own components in some of the arranged areas, you would have to work with facets, similar as I did with the template. Now what I need are attributes. So let's go for first name, last name, and then we can go for male. So I could make first name, last name mandatory. If I do that, then whoever used the declarative component, as soon as he drags and drops it in, will see a dialog, at least in JDeveloper, telling him that this is a mandatory component and he must provide a value. Otherwise it wouldn't work. So I can remember 3 components, so I will leave it as is. Again, I start with an empty page. Now on this empty page, I start putting a panel box as a layout container for it. So this panel box will get a better name, user info. You can make this dynamic. I could even take one attribute and link that to the, you link the attribute to this text field, to the title text, so that you can dynamically squeeze in the title. So if you have not a user info, but you have just an info, like in a shopping cart, you want to say shopping cart open, shopping cart in progress, shopping cart closed. Now you can put that into the title through the attribute if you want. So the next one is a panel layout, which is just making sure that every component is aligned properly for me, and then I put text fields in there. It's input text field. Yep, yeah, input. Here we go. So I drop it in, and then, because it's easier, go to the structure window and take copies of this one. So now I can provide labels here. Could all be dynamic, but for the demo, just hard-code it. So Technology Preview has a slight problem in the layout until it's refreshed. This is why you see the dearrangement of the different labels. But that will go away once we save it and reopen it. So what I want to do is now, this is my area that I want to populate as a declarative component. What I need to do is, I need to fill the data in this content through the attributes I created. So for this, I have a property, which is value. So text field has a value property. And there I come up with expression language builder, and it shows me the properties I have, or the attributes I have defined. So for first name, I have that defined. You see attrib.firstname as a reference to the attribute. And I do the same for last name. And for male as well. And that's my very simplistic component that I built. So I could have a managed bean in that component, so I could put in some magic into that component. So what I want to do next is I want to deploy that component so I can reuse the component. Now what I need to do is I create a deployment profile. So for deployment, I say, just build me a new deployment profile for this application, put it in what we call ADF library jar, which in fact is a normal jar file with additional metadata, so that the tool understands what's it's supposed to do. So let's call that one user info. Why should I change the name? So that's it. So now next step would be to deploy this as a jar file. And then it could go to some kind of repository where all the developers take their declarative components. So if you have a wiki page with declarative components that you develop, that jar file could go up there. Now what the developer would do, he would take the jar file, and then within JDeveloper, so let me close my user info here and go back to my original project, which happened to be my view controller project. So in here I can say, I want to import the functionality. So I create a new file system connection. So I could have the resource that I use from a web server or whatever I want. In this case I have it stored on a file system. So I call it user info. I just copy in the path, test the connection, let's say success. Now it shows up in here. And now when I right click on it, I say add this to the active project. So that could be a library of declarative components that I have available on the file system or somewhere on a shared folder. And then for my application, I want to use that. I say, okay, add this library. Now it's configuring it. So it's configuring the tech library, and it will show up now in my component set as soon as it comes back. And I can work with it as if it was a native library. If I didn't create it myself, I may not even know that this wasn't a native library created. So here's user info. If I would take that one to the bottom right, then this gets added as a component. Okay. So the difference you see is that this one is not write enabled because I didn't put a facet in there. If there was a facet in it that would allow me to put stuff in, then I could click into it. But most important is if I go to the properties of this component, let's select that component. Then here you see it has properties called first name, last name, and mail. Now whatever I put in as data here will later on show at runtime within the component at design time as well. I could use expression language, for instance, to get access to a request scope or session scope, or use expression language to get access to the current selected row in a table. If that is a user table of customers, you can just use this piece to inform about the customer. So that was declarative component development. More scopes. Well, the two scopes that we added so far, and we know that JBoss also did that for their binding layer, which is seam. They added an additional scope. So we added two scopes. One is the view scope, and one is the task scope. Now, what is the view scope? In JavaServer Faces, a view ID represents a page. Now, if on a page you have a subpage, as in Ajax, that performs page navigation in itself, then you have something happening here that is in request scope. Because this goes from this request to that request. But this still stands. Now, if you want to access a scope up here so that you have this as a small scope and this as the broader scope, that is missing. And so we define it as view scope. So as long as the view ID doesn't change, everything you put into the view scope is accessible. Another scope we added is the task scope. Now a task, within a task flow, so say user subscription. For as long as the user is not subscribed, there must be a scope available where you can put stuff in. Once the task that you defined is finished, the user is subscribed, you want to have that to be cleaned up automatically. And that is task flow. Similar scopes are available in Shell, Seam, and as I said, in ADF Faces now. It's just missing in the J2E specification, but obviously because it's just all hash maps that you keep track of in the framework, it's easy to add. Extending the navigation model, I just said that we have a page-to-page navigation in JavaServer Faces, which is not seen as sufficient, because you want to have other navigation. You might want to navigate to a method to do some kind of pre-processing, or instead of using a managed bean to code a decision. So say you have a user that comes on a page, then he presses a button to navigate to the next page, and then based on his role in the company, you want to give him either the manager page, the employee page, or the guest page. Now, today in JavaServer Faces, this would be done within a managed bean. So he presses a button, and in Java code, you would say, no, if this guy is a guest, put him to the guest page, otherwise put him to this page. So you code it in Java, which is just too much. It works, but it's too much, because the information that you get, is this user a guest or is it a manager, that might be just one expression language string away. So there is a notion of a router component that we added. A router is nothing else than just a switcher, where you can say, here's my expression language string. If the outcome of the expression language string is manager, go there. If it's guest, go there. So it's very declaratively. Everybody could read the metadata. You don't have to study the code just to get that working. And this is what we added. So what you see here is a task flow. I'll speak about that a bit later. There are two types of flows that we have. One is what we call the unbound flow. This is what we have today in JavaServer Faces. Any page could be used as an entry point. And then there's something that we call the bound task flow. Now take my example of the subscription. You don't want someone to enter the subscription process in the middle of it, because it's of no sense. You want him to start in the beginning and finish at the end. Under no circumstances you want to allow him to jump straight in the middle. Now that's a bounded task flow. A bounded task flow has a clear definition of a start. And this is what you see with this, I hope you see it, with a green rectangle, which is here. So that identifies the starting point of a flow. And from there, it then goes as the user clicks through the page, because each of these flow steps, view activities as we call them, could be a page. So you see there is a navigation going to a router, so it checks if it's a credit card in this case, or if it's not. If it's a credit card, it goes to validation. If it's not, it goes to a PayPal transfer information. So it goes within its own flow, and it ends up either with reject or approve. So all that you are interested in when you use that is you drag and drop this one into your application flow. So one page in the middle of your application calls this flow, which is kind of a white box. You don't really care for what's happening in there. But what you know is, once this flow is finished, you get either a reject or an accepted in a return. You can pack that up as a jar file, as an ADF library, and distribute that. So that process is reusable out of sudden. And that's missing in JavaServer Faces. So let's see what else. Well, another functionality we provide with bound task flows is, because I said it has a clear definition of how the navigation goes through the page, is these trains. A train component that shows you little bullets on each page where within the process you are. So if you have a wizard style going from wizard step 1 to 7, you always want to know which page I am on in this process. This is what the train can do. And you don't have to code the train. You just, when you create the task flow, you say, yes, build me the train. And then it does it for you. So here's just the same view or similar view we had before, just as a locking page, new user or existing user. Now that one would be represented by this little box. So here's another task flow that actually is also a bound task flow, but to some point reuses this task flow here. So you can have a nesting of task flows, which simplifies the view of the navigation. Because now if I talk to my end user, I can say, look, here I have a flow. There is a create user, which I start with, then I assemble the user details, and to some point I need to subscribe the user with the data I collected. So that's clear. I don't have to drill down in how the subscription works. Now that is maybe something that I discussed that with somebody else. And then I can take this and drag and drop this on a page. There are two options for you to work with task flows. One is to use them within your page-to-page flow, and the other is to specify a specific section on a page and put the task flow in there. Now I have 10 minutes left, and we try to build exactly that. So I will have two pages. One page will show me departments, another page will show me the ability to edit a department, and once I'm done with that, I want to have it going back to the table, and that without changing the page. So let's do that, and this is why I have a top region. I guess you have already anticipated that. So what I first need to do is, I want to create a new task flow, which is just a metadata file. So let's call it browse flow. As well, it could have a template, but it doesn't. So I can say create me a train. If I want to have a train component that I want to add to it, it would create the train model that I can use. There's an option to say I want to have this created with page fragments, in which case it has an extension of JSF, which is not a full standalone page, or I can use full standalone pages. If I want to have it working within a page, I use fragments. I can always build first a standalone task flow with full pages and transfer that later on in JSF. So I could start with a full page flow, but in this case, okay, I know that I want to have something embedded, so I create an embedded flow. It comes with a blank area for me now to put some views in there. I don't want to have this one. So now, you see this is the starting point, will be called first. So let's call that browse and call this edit. Then we create navigation cases. So whenever I hit the edit button, when I hit the edit button, it should navigate to the edit page. And when I'm done with that, and I hit the submit button, I want to navigate back to the table. So, submit. So let's start building the page. I could also use templates for the page, which only makes sense, I guess, just to be consistent. So I run it without a template. So what I do here is I drag and drop a table, departments, as a table, read only, and all that I need from the table is that I can select a row. So I can make one row as selected. So once the table is built, I will drop another button that only has the responsibility to make sure my application navigates to another page. So let's see. So where's my button? I didn't. So let me do it here. So put it in here, put it in there. Now my button shows here. So let's call it edit. So I'm not beautifying it here, so I just keep it simple to the point. So I could put magnificent layout containers around it so that they are sized whenever you resize the browser and all that. I stay away from that for this demo. So now I need to go to my edit fragment. And here I use the same view object in this case, and I create a form. And this form should have a submit button. And that's all I need to do. So for this button, all I say is, well, when I press you, call the submit navigation, which means go back from where you're coming from. The same on the browse page, I tell the edit button, whenever I press you, call the edit navigation case. So that's it. So I created two pages that if I run them, I start with a browse page, I select a row, I press the edit button, it goes to the edit form, I press submit, it goes back. Now, how do I get this into my lovely application that I'm going to create here? And as you would have expected it, it's drag and drop. So I have a page flow created, and this page flow is my browse flow. If I take this one and drag it over, it creates me something like a region. A region is a placeholder that now will take the content of the task flow. So if you want, it's another kind of component. Pretty much plays well into this template declarative component region kind of thing, reusability. So let's run that. So while it starts up, I give you the last missing piece. I was using that, which is binding, a declarative approach to build applications that have the UI bound to underlying business services without coding it. Now that's ADF in Oracle. It's based on JSR 227 that we're still driving for standardization. And that allows you to bind my UI, no matter what it is, without coding, purely through metadata to an underlying business service like Enterprise Java Beans, JDBC, Pojo, web service, you name it, without big coding. So let's see how far my body is here. So one of the reasons why we have all that is productivity. And we're talking not only about performance during runtime, but we talk about performance during development. So we try to reduce the time that a developer needs to build a page to a minimum. Also, we try to reduce the required skill level to a minimum. If you all handcraft it, which is a fair enough approach to take, you're in full control, but actually you need to have a decent skill level. Now we don't have that. We don't have 7,000 developers with all the same skill set. They all are experts in some areas, but still you want to leverage them in other areas. So for this reason, you need to simplify it. So what I have here is, okay, you see. Lucky enough, I used a splitter. So that's my region up here. I have a scrollable table that has nothing to do with this table, so they're completely independent. Yeah. So let's click edit here. Oh no. Let's click the link again. So I was too positive. You see the name in my declarative component, and it really looks like a real component, right? You see, even the Ajax stuff works. Oh, this one hates me. Okay, last attempt for running out of time. No, I'm not toying around with the Ajax stuff. I just show you the task flow right away. So even my declarative component has the Ajax functionality kept that I get from the component, so I inherit the whole thing. And I can also make it part of this partial refresh that I said, where I have a specific area in my page to just refresh the component. All I would do, either wrap it in another component that understands the partial page refresh, or just call a method on my declarative component. Because my declarative component can have methods that I can call from externally. I would use those methods to enforce some kind of behavior. I say that my declarative component includes a tree. I want the tree to expand without the user clicking on it. So I might just call a method and have then this method going to a managed bean, and the managed bean would then get a handle to the tree and expand it. So you can get the build that I have here and that I should use for the demo from OTN. So it's otn.oracle.com. You get all software from Oracle from there. There are also the help forums that we maintain. Plus, you get this technology preview. So I press edit. And you see only the upper part changes, so I can perform my edits to ITS, ATS. I go back, press submit. Again, it's just the task flow that it's executing. If only it would, no, now it's failed something. Okay. So that's the typical effect if you show something like that. Now I would go back, refresh the table, and the idea is that the rest of the page is not affected. It is as if you would have small portlets on a page that are maintained by the lifecycle. And you can imagine that it's not restricted to just 4 areas. You can have as many areas as you want. And this kind of flexibility really brings development forward. And some of the ideas are considered for JavaServer Faces 2.0. Some of the ideas is just what we have to bring forward to the expert community to explain to them how that works. A lot of the components are planned to go open source, like all the ADF Faces Rich Client component. Once we go production with JDF 11, we start a project that will open source them. I'm not sure if templating will be part of the open source. Last information was yes, that it is, but we will see as soon as we go production. Okay, that's it from my side. You got it on tape? Or do I have to repeat? Oh, you said you run out of tapes. So we do it again. Welcome, everybody. Now, thank you for listening and attending and staying with me until the late evening hours. If there are questions, let me know. If not, go home. No, sorry, don't go home. There's this party. Go to the party. Don't go home. Okay, any questions? You want to know the time, or it's almost 6? Okay, thank you, and have a great party.